Illustrator, musician, art director, magician, designer, historian, escape artist, sideshow fire eater, male model, pop culture lecturer, and publisher, Steranko has cut a ferocious path through the entertainment arts. As a musician, he gigged with Bill Haley and the Comets, something that I didn't know, in the early days of rock and roll, and he put the first Go-Go Girls on stage. As an expert on the four-color medium, he authored 2 volumes of the history of comics, which have sold more than 100,000 copies each and are still the definitive resource on the form. As an escape artist, he performed a host of death-defying challenges, from being buried alive to hazardous underwater escapes. Those performances inspired the character Mr. Miracle, and according to Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Michael Chabon, Steranko was the man upon whom the protagonist of The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay was based. Whitson magazine credited Steranko as the 5th most influential comics artist in the history of the form. Surprisingly, he created only 29 comic books, barely nothing compared to the hundreds and thousands of issues some artists have done. Yet in that limited number, he developed 150 narrative devices, never before used in the comic book medium, 10 times more than all the other artists put together, and that changed the direction of the comics medium. As an illustrator, he set what might be a world's record for visualizing more classical fictional heroic characters than any other artist, in addition to producing a multitude of movie posters, record albums, and magazine cover paintings. His international newsstand entertainment magazine Preview had an impressive 25-year run and was a forerunner of similar titles such as Premiere, Movie Line, and Entertainment Weekly. As an editor, Steranko conducted hundreds of superstar interviews and penned more than 3 million words for the publication. He has collaborated with such top filmmakers as George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, created the look of Indiana Jones and the initial production illustrations for Raiders of the Lost Ark. Steranko was among the first to be hired by Francis Ford Coppola for Bram Stoker's Dracula, on which he was the film's project conceptualist and served in a similar capacity for 3 other of the director's projects. I don't know if you remember the sequence in Dracula where these eyes were up in the corner of the screen following the action. When I first saw Dracula, I thought, Steranko. In 1974, he created Red Tide, the first modern graphic novel, years before Eisner's Contract with God. Steranko has won numerous awards in both Europe and America, lectured on popular culture, and exhibited his work at more than 300 international exhibitions, including the Louvre in Paris. He scripted for Warner Brothers the Justice League TV series and served as creative consultant for the History Channel's recent 2-hour documentary, Comic Book Superheroes Unmasked. His S.H.I.E.L.D. TV reviews for the Hollywood Reporter occasionally elicited more hits than any other feature. He has shaken up Twitter with his innovative TNT technique and is currently prepping an evening with Steranko for live theatrical venues across the country. And he's still the best-dressed man in comics. Ladies and gentlemen, one of my heroes, and I'm sure yours, Jim Steranko.
Hey, thank you for the clap. And can we have a hand for John Workman, my old friend? Thank you. John and I collaborated on one of my major projects years ago. And we've kind of kept in touch ever since. And thank you very much for that. That exhausted me. I was just standing out here, I was ready to turn in. John and I have known each other for about 35 or 40 years at least. There's nothing I wouldn't do for him, there's nothing he wouldn't do for me. And that's the way it's been for 40 years. We haven't done a damn thing for each other.
Well, there's so many things throughout your life that I kind of wondered about, but the major one, and to finally get an answer to this is amazing to me. I have to tell you that when you started working for Marvel, I missed your entrance to the company. And not really missed it, I'd set it aside. I was getting...
Don't worry, your aim will get better.
Well, I was, as a teenager, I was always aware of money. And I found out that there were certain comics that I liked, but I didn't like them that much. And I found out that there was a store nearby that sold used comics for 5 cents. And if I maybe...
Those were the good old days.
I would buy ECs from the 50s for 5 cents each. But...
don't torture us, John, please.
I found out that if I waited a week, some of the new comics that were 12 cents, I could get for 5 cents. And Strange Tales kind of fell down in my estimation. And I stopped buying it new and picked it up for 5 cents. And somewhere along in there, I started sort of segregating those comics, and I didn't read them for a few months. And when I started reading the Nick Fury stuff, I thought, wait a minute, this guy is really good. I even mispronounced his name, though. I thought it was Steranko. This Steranko guy is fantastic. And what have I started buying them new. And what I've wondered about all these years, I know that you worked with Joe Simon at Harvey. And I know that you, I've seen some of your earlier stuff, but how did you do this? It was like you just came on and boom, there you were, and you were doing incredible things. You seem to have an understanding of what could be done with comics way beyond most people. How the heck did you do that?
You know, many of you have spent almost your entire lives in comic books, am I right? I mean, your whole lives, and you've invested much of that. Yeah, raise your hand if you've been like in comics your whole life. Look at this, look at this. We have that in common because I grew up as a very poor kid. I lived in a shack that my father built with his hands. We were so poor that there were no pictures hanging in the house. I'm often asked a similar question to John's is, where did you get started? I can tell you the earliest drawings I remember making in the winter. The winters were so brutal, and we didn't have double panes of glass, just single window pane glass in very leaky window frames. And when I was a little kid, it was often so cold that ice would form on the insides of the windows. And we didn't have any paper tablets or pads or anything for me to draw on. Couldn't afford it. Couldn't afford even a nickel. And using the heat of my fingertips, I would practice drawing pictures on the ice on the inside of the windows. Those are the first drawings I remember making. My uncle would sometimes bring comic books, used comic books. Do you know those nickel comic books?
Oh, yeah.
You might have shopped at the same store that you were at, John. And he'd bring them over in a shopping bag. And I literally grew up from the time I was a baby with comic books as part of my misspent youth. I think I can tell you this story. I was talking to my mother a couple of years ago, and she said, did you know that you were reading at 1.5 years? And I said, Mom, give me a break. And she said, no, it's absolutely true. So about a week later, we're talking to her again, and you know how mothers have their baby books? You know what I mean? They keep all the information, you know, the kids, the babies in it, height and weight, etc. And she had my baby book there. And she pointed to an entry that she had made when I was 1.5 years old. She notated that, and she said, here it is. You could read. And I said, how did that happen? And she said, when my Uncle Gene would bring over these bags of comic books, I'd pick out a favorite, and I'd sit in my mother's lap, and she'd have the comic book in front of it, and I would point to the balloons, and she'd read them to me. And we did it so many times that I literally learned to read English by reading comic books. I said, how did you know that I didn't memorize them? Memorize the lines? And she said, we thought about that and we covered over the pictures so that just the balloons would show, and then asked you to read. How's that for insidious? My own mother. And she said, you were reading fluently at 1.5 years. So I tell you this story because you and I are in the same brotherhood. We grew up and loved this comic book form. It was in my blood, it was in my soul. The first real drawing I remember making was a chalk drawing on a sidewalk in front of kindergarten in school. I started kindergarten at 4. And I drew, and this is during World War II, I drew a dog fight. That is, Japanese Zeros attacking American P-48s. And planes crashing, going down and, in smoke. And I drew this in one big block. This was a 4-foot block of cement in chalk. It was the first drawing I could ever remember making. It had to be when I was about 4 years old. I've been waiting ever since to find it on eBay. I'm hoping it'll show up sometime and maybe I can recapture my misspent youth. Well, look, I'm certain that many of you here in this room learned to read or honed your craft, at least of reading and writing, by looking at comic books. Am I close to it? There you go, see? So we're part of that same brotherhood now. Can I tell you who else is part of it? Federico Fellini, the great Italian director, La Dolce Vita, etc., La Strada. He learned to read English by reading American comic books. Does anybody know who Fritz Lang was? Metropolis, M, right? Great German director. He learned the American idiom by reading comic strips. So you see, we're not alone. We're not isolated in this. We've got a heavyweight, roster. One of my friends, Alain Resnais. Anybody know that name? French director of Hiroshima, Mon Amour, and last year at Marienbad. Alain told me himself that he learned English by reading American comic books. So we've got that in common with some of those guys. I just thought you might like to know that. I really never had an art lesson in my life. We were simply too poor to for me to go to college or art school. I'm not sure I really would have been interested in going to any college that would really enroll me. And so, like most of the Sterankos, I'm self-taught. I could tell you this little story. One of my cousins, Tommy Moran, Tommy was the best lounge pianist in my area. Lounge pianist. Been at it for a lifetime. This guy was really good. And about 30 years ago, I decided to switch over from other instruments that I was playing, including guitar, to keyboard, because unlike guitar, where you have 6 notes you can play at once, or saxophones where you can only play 1 note at a time, you have 88 notes. You got a whole orchestra. And I thought, this is something I'd like to experiment with. Because if there are any musicians here in the audience, I love to play with chord progressions, substitutions, additions, alterations, and piano is the instrument to do it on. So, I called up my cousin Tommy Moran. I said, hey Tommy, I want to learn to play piano. I want you to teach me a couple things. And he said, no. Tommy, you're my blood. No. I said, you owe me an explanation. He said, well, to put it bluntly, we all know that nobody can teach the Sterankos anything. You're on your own. And so I learned it to play just like I did drawing, on my own. I remember when I was a kid, you know, I told you about the short